Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel Mind Your Exam. So in this video we will be studying about tuples in Python programming language. So let's start with what is a tuple. A tuple is again an ordered sequence of elements. So by sequence of elements we mean that a tuple can contain more than one element also. It can contain a single element, but it can also contain multiple elements. And ordered sequence means that every element has an index position associated with it. So if there are two tuples which have same elements but the order of those elements are different, then they are two different tuples. Okay, so it is an ordered data type, ordered sequence data type, and each of the elements that are present in the tuple can belong to any of the data types. Okay, so you do not need to worry about which data type you are storing in the tuple. It can be an integer, float, string, or a combination of these. Okay, now what is different in a tuple as compared to a list? So a list was also an ordered sequence of elements which can contain elements of any data type and mixed data type, but the difference is the list used to be enclosed in square brackets, but tuples are enclosed in round brackets. Okay, and tuples are not mutable, they are immutable as compared to lists. Lists were mutable in nature. Okay, so we will discuss about immutability towards the end of this video, but before that you must know that again whenever you are writing elements of a tuple, they have to be separated by commas, and each element of that tuple will be assigned an index value. The indexes start from 0 in the positive direction, and negative indices are also available starting from -1 and going till from right to left. Okay, so let's take an example. If we have a tuple, say 1 2 3 4 5, and you want to print that tuple, then the output of that print statement will be the elements separated by commas but in round brackets. Okay, now this was a tuple that contained the data, all the elements were from the integer data type, the same data. Okay, but the same data type values. But here if we want to define a tuple which has elements belonging to different data types, then that is also allowed in Python. That is not an error. Okay, so when you print this tuple, you will get a sequence of elements that you specified, separated by commas and enclosed in round brackets. Okay, now another important point that you must remember is that although tuple itself is immutable, but it can contain in itself mutable data types. So here is an example of a tuple that contains the fourth element as a list. So list in itself is a mutable data type, and this particular element is mutable. But when you talk about tuple 3, the entire tuple is itself immutable. So any kind of element is allowed inside a tuple, whether it is mutable or not. Okay, and the last is you can have nested tuples. We will be discussing nested tuples in detail in a separate video, but as of now you can remember that a tuple can have as its element another tuple inside it. Okay, so in this case we have the elements 1 2 3 4 5, and the sixth element is a tuple having two elements 10 and 20. Okay, now the next important point you must remember about tuples is that whenever you need to declare a tuple having a single value, then you must follow the single element of the tuple by a comma, and if you do not do that, the tuple will not create a tuple. The Python interpreter will create it as an independent element. So for example, if you write a statement like this, tuple 5 equal to round brackets 20, since although in this statement you want to create a tuple having a single element 20, but actually this statement is incorrect for doing so, because this particular statement will do what it will do, it will create a variable named tuple 5 and it will store the integer value 20 in it. And how you can check that? You can find out the type of this variable. So when we do type of tuple 5, you will get the result as class int. So what this means is that the variable that you just declared and printed, see, during printing also it is printing that the value of this tuple is, the variable tuple 5 is 20. It is not giving any round brackets even when you specified the round brackets here. So essentially this particular statement is just creating a variable tuple 5 and assigning an integer to it, which is 20. Okay. How can you declare a tuple having a single element? So the correct way of doing so is specifying the single element, writing down a comma after it, and then enclosing it in the round brackets. And here when you find out and print what is the type of tuple 5 in this case, you will get the return value as class tuple. So this particular variable tuple 5 in the second case belongs to the class tuple. So please remember, if you want to create a tuple with a single element, the single element inside the tuple should be followed by a comma. Okay. Then another important point is that if you create a variable named in this case sequence, or seq is the name of the variable, and you assign it multiple values which are separated by commas. Here the values are not enclosed in any kind of round brackets, but still if you do something like this, then by default the Python interpreter treats this particular statement as a declaration or definition of a tuple. So if you create a variable and assign it a comma separated sequence of values, then the Python interpreter will create this particular variable as a tuple. Okay, and when you print it, you will get these elements separated by commas enclosed in round brackets. Okay, so you have to be very careful that even if you do not put round brackets around the multiple elements that you are specifying, the Python interpreter will create it as a tuple, and for declaring a single element you need to separate it and specify a comma after the single element for the tuple. Now the next important point is how to access the elements of a tuple. Since I told you in the beginning of this video that a tuple is an ordered sequence data type, that means every element has an index value associated with it. So if we have a tuple named tuple 1 and it has the elements 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and we want to access the first element, then what we can do, we can follow the same procedure that we did with strings and list. We specify the index value in not round brackets here, we specify the index value in square brackets, and then we will get the first element when we specify the index as 0. Okay, so tuple 1 is the name of the tuple here, and the element which we want to access is the first element. So we specify its index in square brackets, and that index is 0. Now if we want to access the fourth element, we will write something like this: tuple 1 square brackets 3, and you will get the fourth element, which is 0, 1, 2 and 3, the 8 value 8 here. Okay. Now other rules of slicing and indexing apply to tuples also, just like lists and strings. Like you cannot specify an index value that is out of the range or that exceeds the length of the tuple. In that case you will get an index error. And the other rule is of negative indexing, that you can definitely apply negative indexing on tuples as well and specify the and get the values of the variables from right to left by specifying the indices as -1. So in this case the last element 12 from tuple 1 will have an index value of -1, then 10 will have -2 index, and so on. Okay. And also you can specify expressions while accessing the elements of a tuple. So this expression must evaluate to an integer index, whether positive or negative, and then you can retrieve the element that you are trying to retrieve. Okay, so the last point for this video is the immutability of tuples. As I mentioned in the beginning, that once you have defined a tuple, you cannot change the elements that are present in the tuple. So if you do something like this, tuple 1, and you try to change the value of the fifth element, which in this case is 5, to something like 10, then you will get a type error that tuple does not support item assignment. So what does that mean? That once you have declared a tuple, you cannot reassign any index value of the tuple to a new value. Okay, but again, as I mentioned previously, in itself, when a tuple contains a mutable data type, so in this case we have a tuple 2 which contains elements 1, 2, 3 and a mutable data type which is the list, you can change the value of this mutable data type. So when you do something like tuple 2 index values 3 and 1, so basically the same logic of nested lists apply here. Since this is a nested okay, so we cannot say nested tuple because inside it is a list, but you will specify double index values here. The first index value in this case, which is 3, will help you reach the list because the list is the fourth element of tuple 2. The index value of list is 3, and within the list, when you want to access the second element, which is 9, you specify the second index in square brackets, which is 1. So tuple 2, 3, 1 will give you assign this value 10. Now when you print this tuple, you can see that the changes are reflected in this case. So initially, when we have a tuple, you cannot completely change the value of a tuple, but in case if an element of the tuple is a mutable type, then you can change that particular element. Okay, so you can go through these important points that are mentioned in your book here. So list is a mutable data type, but tuple is immutable. But the difference between list and tuple is that when you iterate through a tuple, iterating a tuple is faster as compared to a list. Okay, and also if we want to have a variable in which you do not want the elements to be changed by anybody, then you want to create a tuple. It would be better to create a tuple than a list. Okay, so this was all for today. I hope you understood all the concepts of tuples. If you have any doubts, you can mention us in the comments section below, and you can also tell which other topics from Python or any other computer science subjects you would like to study. We'll definitely take those up in the future video. Thank you for watching. Till we meet in the next video, mind your exam.